Raimondo, and I'm the Director of the Global Development Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm delighted to open our first Women in Global Development program of the year to a sold-out audience. Thank you all for joining us this evening for a timely and incredibly important discussion. Last fall, we had an impressive group of inspiring and internationally recognized speakers join us to discuss key global issues. And we have many more exciting programs lined up for this year. Tomorrow, we will announce the speakers, agenda, and theme for our 5th Annual International Women's Day Global Health Symposium, which will be held on March 10th. We hope you can all join us. Turning back to tonight's program, it is on the record and we are live streaming, so please silence your phones. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. This evening, we will take questions both from the stage as well as through our online survey application. The link is currently displayed on screen. If you have an internet-enabled device, please type chi.cnf.io directly into your browser and select today's program. You can ask a question or vote on other questions. I'd like to also thank our sponsors, our lead sponsor, Horizon Pharma, supporting sponsors, Abbott and USG, and our patron sponsors, the Frankel Family Foundation, Holtus Trust, and Ashley and Avery McCall. Thank you for your continued support of the Women in Global Development Forum. I would also like to thank the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for partnering with us on today's event, and welcome student groups from the Latin School of Chicago and the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools. Since the start of the Syrian conflict in 2011, the UN estimates that more than 250,000 people have been killed and 4.8 million are now refugees. I look forward to hearing this evening from our speakers on the situation in Syria and learning more on how these local Chicago residents are propelling action and awareness. I hope you had a chance to see our speaker bios on screen, but please allow me to highlight a few of their additional achievements. Dr. Samer Attar has been on several surgical missions to Jordan and Syria with the Syrian American Medical Society and Doctors Without Borders. He's also testified at the UN on the medical and humanitarian conditions in Aleppo. Becky Carroll co-founded and organized the social media campaign Stand With Aleppo and Ask About Aleppo, which have gained local and international recognition and have heightened advocacy and awareness on the situation in Syria. Dr. Zaher Saloul is a senior advisor of the Syrian American Medical Society and leads the Global Response Program to address the refugee crisis. He's been on numerous medical missions to Syria, Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and Greece, and has testified before UN Security Council and US Congress. Last but not least, our moderator, Cameron Hudson, who's the director of the Simon Skoyat Center for the Prevention on the Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, today's partner organization. He's previously worked for the UN, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the International Organization on Migration. We want to kick off the discussion with a brief video, after which Mr. Hudson will moderate the discussion and audience Q&A. Thank you.
Right now, they're being sieged and starved and bombed. People there haven't had any fresh food, fuel, medicines, supplies, or humanitarian personnel coming in or out. The whole city is totally sealed off and cut off from the outside world.
First of all, there's no day and night. You have 24 hours of work. Every few hours you have new victims of barrel bombing or airstrikes, and you have to take care of them. I saw a patient, his name is Ahmad, 5 years old. He had shrapnel of barrel bombing in his spinal cord. Unfortunately, he died one day after I left. And this is one of hundreds of patients that the doctors and the nurses have to deal with every day. I've seen children pointing to the sky, and then you see this dot, which is the helicopter. And you hear the sound, the rumbling sound of the helicopter. And then this dot will throw another dot, and this is a barrel bomb. Barrel bomb is a big barrel that is stuffed with TNT and shrapnels, and it's thrown on a neighborhood, it is a weapon of mass destruction. It can destroy the whole block. And the only thing that you can do if you are a civilian and you are seeing this, that you can pray and run or hide.
They feel like they've been abandoned. They feel that for years no one's been listening. They feel like they've been screaming to the world for help and that very few have come to help them.
What can the international community do? The first thing is to pay attention to what's happening in Syria. No-fly zone or safe zones, and also maintaining access to areas under siege by having humanitarian corridors and protect these civilians that are the victims of the war.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to express my thanks to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for inviting me and all of the panelists here tonight, and for all that they've done to continue to shine a light on the situation in Syria. I think for all of us who work on this, going into 6 years now of conflict and crisis in Syria, it's hard to sustain global attention and empathy, frankly. And so I think discussions like tonight's, and certainly the work of all of our panelists, I think help to amplify why that's so necessary. So thank you to our partner and our host here tonight. If you've shown up, you're probably not new to this issue tonight, and you don't need a lot of lesson about what's going on. But I do think it's important to kind of frame where we are at the start of 2017, because I think it magnifies actually the truly heroic efforts of our panelists when we consider how great the scope of conflict and crisis is in Syria. And so some of these statistics, while numbing, I think bear some repeating. We're nearing, or perhaps have already exceeded 500,000 deaths in Syria. We don't know yet because the UN stopped counting 3 years ago because they couldn't keep up with the death toll and they couldn't gain access to areas where people were dying. So we don't have an accurate number, but we can say that we are on par with some of the estimates of the Rwandan genocide and nearly 5 times as many as those killed in the Balkans wars, just to kind of situate the death toll scale of the Syrian conflict. According to the UN, more than 13.5 million of Syria's 18 million people are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. 9 million of 18 million people have been internally displaced. 5 million more have been driven out of the country into Syria's 5 neighboring states. Today, 1 in 10 Jordanians is Syrian, just to give you some sense of what it is doing to the region and the resources of the region. And so all the while these numbers continue to mount, at the end of 2016, just 2 weeks ago, the UN announced that only 56% of the humanitarian appeal, financial appeal for responding to the crisis in Syria had been met. And so I think when you understand the scale of the conflict and the scale of the need that has been produced by this conflict, it's all the more amazing that we have, I think, local Chicagoans and average citizens who have taken such extraordinary actions to shine a light, to bring attention, and to bring some of their expertise to bear on this conflict. And so I'm honored to be on the stage with them. I was honored to meet the 2 doctors at the Holocaust Museum this summer when they had just returned from a trip to Aleppo, which they'll talk about tonight. And we made this video to capture the just total overwhelming sense of what was going on there. And I think you see it both in their eyes in the video and on stage tonight. And so I want to address the question to frankly all of our panelists. The first one, which is, how did you get involved in going to Syria and becoming involved in trying to raise attention and to bring your expertise to bear? What was the thing that got it started for you? And I'll start with you, Dr. Attar.
Yeah, thank you, Cameron. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you to the Chicago Council. I'm an American. I was born and raised in Chicago, but my heritage is Syrian, and mom and dad are from Syria. So when the war started and I learned about doctors and hospitals being targeted, really, if you're a doctor or a nurse or a paramedic, anyone with any sense of medical background or training in a setting like Syria, all you got to do is show up. So for me, this was just my small way of giving back to my heritage and my upbringing.
I'm Becky Carroll. It's a real honor to be here tonight and be sitting next to these incredible gentlemen. I've always been engaged in human rights and social issues going back to when I was in high school, when I was marching against apartheid and peace in Northern Ireland. And I've been in politics for 20 years working on campaigns, so it's always been something near and dear to me. And I'm sad to say that I really didn't pay a lot of attention to what was going on in Syria until, like most Americans, saw the picture of that little boy, Alan Kurdi, who washed up on the shores of Turkey, who was trying to escape Syria with his family. And as a relatively new mom at the time, I saw that and I couldn't help but feel a connection to him and his family, and I felt incredibly moved to do something. So I started connecting with local Syrian refugee groups, like the one that Suzanne Akras runs, and others, helped put together a fundraiser and just tried to stay connected. And it was about a year later that, actually, thanks to these two doctors, that the co-founder, Wendy Whittam, and I became connected to a doctor in Aleppo named Dr. Omar, who was actually the last neurosurgeon in Aleppo, only 29 years old, and found him to be an incredibly selfless, brave person who stayed there to, along with his other 29 colleagues, to continue trying to save lives. And we became friends by talking on WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger every single day. And it was incredibly insightful because he was literally on the front lines every day in the hospital, relaying these stories to us. And Wendy works in the news media, and I work in communications and politics and public policy. And we were just like, wow, why is no one writing about this and talking about this? Where are our leaders? And it was just a few weeks later that his hospital, M10, where I think both of these doctors may have worked at some time, got bombed a couple of times. And we lost contact with him, and we frankly became a little desperate. We finally got in touch with him, and we had been searching online and looking for news about it and looking for the outrage from international leaders, whether it was the UN or Obama or anyone, and there was nothing. I think we were just so frustrated. We were like, well, we have to do something. So we just decided to launch a little social media campaign. We came up with the hashtag Stand With Aleppo. We created a Facebook page, invited like-minded friends, came up with a basic social media activation plan, created a banner with a picture of a little girl named Doa, who was a patient of Dr. Omar's, a toddler who unfortunately died a few days after we launched the campaign. And on Sunday, October 2nd, we just started posting. And within a couple of days, we had 300 people joining our group. We trended on Twitter, and we were just like, wow, like, I don't think we did anything special, but what I think we realized is there are a lot of other people like they're out there like us who wanted to use their voice in some way and channel that energy to speak up on behalf of what was happening in Aleppo. And so that's how I got involved. And a few months later, I think we have like some statistics between the time that we launched on October 2nd and by the end of the year, we had nearly 700,000 tweets, 60,000 participants on Twitter alone with a reach of 1.5 billion people. So, it was not really us per se. I think we just helped give people an avenue in which to engage. And we're very happy and pleased to have been a part of that.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm really honored. And, I came from a city in Syria called the Windy City because of the real wind. From a city called Homs, and if you actually pass by Homs, you will see the trees leaning westward because of the real wind, and fortunately came to the other windy city in the United States. And I love my city. I love every one of you that you made it here to listen about what's going on in my homeland. I just came in a couple of days ago from a medical mission to Jordan, and I'll just give you an example of what you expect to see in Al-Zatari camp. Al-Zatari camp is one of the largest refugee camps that is hosting Syrian refugees. At one point, they had 170,000 people, refugees, fifth largest city in Jordan. You mentioned about one out of each 10 Jordanians who's Syrian. Right now, they have about 75,000. And I saw this old man who's 80 years old, who's been living in the camp for 5 years, and he had breathing problem. I'm a lung specialist. I work at Christ Hospital here in Oak Lawn. So I took with me some nebulizers, some inhalers, and I gave him a nebulizer. He was telling me that he cannot breathe, and there is no electricity, and he sometimes borrowed the nebulizer of his neighbor. So I explained to him how to do the nebulizer, and then I asked him, why are you still here? Why don't you go back to your village? He's from a village called Asura near Dar'a. Dar'a is where the first demonstration that happened in 2011 as part of the Arab Spring. And I remember 1 month before the first demonstration, I went to Syria to visit my parents who live still in Homs. And at that time, there were rumors that there were some children in Dar'a who wrote on the wall that your time is coming, oh doctor. Doctor is the Dr. Bashar al-Assad, who is the president of Syria, who happened to be my classmate from medical school. So as part of the Arab Spring, people in Syria started to demonstrate after the security system in Syria, which is known to be brutal, took these children who wrote on the wall in Dar'a, and they tortured them. And then when their families went to the security in Dar'a, and they told them, can you release these children? They don't know what they wrote on the wall. They told them, forget your children, and why don't you go back to your home and produce new children? And if you cannot produce new children, we'll help you producing new children. And this is very offensive to people in that area. And so the demonstration started in Dar'a at that time, and then I think we all know what happened. The regimes responded with extreme brutality, and people started to carry arms. So I asked this old man, why don't you go back to your village? He told me there is no more village. The village was completely destroyed by the Syrian regime, by barrel bomb, and if I went there, I don't have anything else to live in. And this is one out of millions of refugees. We're talking about 5 million refugees right now dispersed throughout the region and in Europe. And these people don't have home. Most of them don't have homes to go back or villages. And if they have homes, then they are very afraid of this regime that has destroyed their life, tortured their neighbors, and killed their family members. This is only one reason. I lived the crisis every minute over the past 5 years. I'm a physician also, and what's happening in Syria is offensive to every physician because there's attacks on doctors and nurses and hospitals. More than 750 doctors and nurses were killed. More than 350 hospitals were attacked by the regime. This new normal that is created in Syria has not been done in other conflicts. When you attack a doctor because they are trying to save lives, this is something that the international community and all physicians and people who have conscience should, object to. Using chemical weapons more than 166 times is not normal, even in conflicts, and this should be something that we object to. I believe in civic engagement. I believe in the responsibility of citizens to change their neighborhood to the better, and also to the world to the better. And that's why I go back and forth to provide aid to the people who are in need in Syria.
So what can you say about how attitudes, you alluded to this a little bit, how attitudes have changed? Because 6 years is, we're at a period of time where the Syria conflict is going on longer than World War II, right, to give that some frame. So how have the attitudes of people changed in the course of the 6 years of this conflict? The people who were lucky enough, frankly, to get out early versus the people who are getting out now. How has it evolved being away and displaced for so long? How has it evolved given the evolution of the tactics of the Syrian regime? And you highlighted some of the particularly egregious war crimes that are being committed by the Assad regime. It didn't start out like that. It evolved over time, and I'm just curious, mentally, where are the people now that you're treating and encountering on your medical missions?
Well, I mean, in the beginning, people were hoping that things will change in Syria, and people believed that what happened in Egypt and Tunisia, where you have, people who demonstrated, and then you had regime who were changed, and they believed in democracy. They believed that they will have their liberties the same way that we have our liberties. And most of the people who went to the streets were young people. In Syria, more than 65% of people are below the age of 25. Many of them don't have, they have education but don't have future because of the corruption and the brutality and the oppression of the regime. And so there was a lot of hope initially. And you go there and people will tell you, okay, maybe 1 month or I'll go back to home, or 2 months I'll go back to home. And also at the same time here in the United States, there was also a lot of sympathy with the people, and the media reflected that. With time, with the chaos that were created with ISIS, became part of the scene, people started to get less and less hopeful. And also the sympathy to the Syrian people in the United States also dwindled. And people, when you mention Syria, they also always comes to mind ISIS or Daesh, as we call it in Arabic, and terrorism, instead of the sympathy with the people who are demonstrating against a brutal regime. Right now, in this last mission, people were very pessimistic, I would say. No one is expected to go back in the near future. Unfortunately, the average time for a refugee to go back to their homeland in the world is about 20 years. And many people in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey don't expect to go back to Syria ever. The recent stride of the regime and the advances with the help of the Russians and the Iranians are making things even worse. And I think the transition, the political transition in the United States is not also helping with the Trump administration. So there's a lot of pessimism in the Middle East, which is very dangerous, because if we want really to win the hearts and the minds of the people and change their life to the better, that is what is happening right now is not helping at all.
So I want to take you back to, I guess, was it last summer? Yeah. Was your last medical mission to Aleppo, when it was really, I think, at or near the height of the siege of the city. And just explain to us what the conditions were like then, what they're like now for average people, because I think we spend a lot of time talking about, and I did it myself, the millions of people who are displaced, the millions of people who have left Syria, and who are in relative safety in camps in neighboring countries, but there are millions more trapped inside of homes, inside of Idlib, inside of Aleppo. And so I want to give folks a sense of what it's like to be trapped in these places.
Yeah, this past July was my last trip, and back then there was only one supply road into Aleppo at the time, the Castello Road. And even driving that road was kind of a roll of the dice, because it smelled, you could smell dead bodies, you could still see burning vehicles and craters from where helicopters and jets had previously dropped missiles and bombs. And at any moment in the car, you felt like you might get blown up, because there's no overhead protection. But people would go back and forth every day in order to sell fruits and vegetables and run their businesses, and also to deliver medical supplies and fuel. In the hospital where I worked, it was called M10. My first trip there was 4 years ago. It's been hit by airstrikes so many times that it's literally underground in a basement. It has a ramp that they built directly from the street leading into the basement. And the people there, their attitude was, life's really not going to be better anywhere else in Syria, where they're likely to get shot or bombed or arrested or tortured or imprisoned. And they'd rather die at home than die drowning on a boat or freezing or starving in a refugee camp in a country where they probably wouldn't feel welcome. And the hospital itself was in the surrounding community, and the community always felt, we always felt like we were under threat, the threat of bombardment, barrel bombs, cluster bombs. When a market or a school or a home got hit, we'd be so inundated with wounded people that there'd be no place to put people except on the floor, and there'd be no place to step. And we'd only had 3 operating rooms, and some days when all the operating rooms were full, those of us that were outside would be doing operations on the floor or on gurneys, on stretchers, without anesthesia. And you feel like you're saving one person at the expense of letting someone else die, because this is not a metropolitan emergency room where it's all hands on deck. You only have so many people, so many hands, so many resources, and you do the best you can, and you're doing it with this very sick and kind of nauseating feeling that at any moment the bombs are landing so close, you might find yourself dead or dismembered on the floor next to the people you're trying to help. So that was the feeling. Whenever you're working in Aleppo, that's the feeling, and that's the way it was when I was there 4 years ago. And every time I went back, that feeling just got worse. And in July, it just progressively escalated to where it felt like it was happening all the time.
So I want to talk about the fall of Aleppo, because I think, for anybody who had paid attention to this conflict in the last 3 months, I think there was a kind of unprecedented situation where we collectively watched the fall of Aleppo live. We watched it in real time on our phones, on our social media feeds. We saw people delivering their own eulogies online and saying goodbye. And I think it's really the first time we have experienced that sort of collective failing and been a part of it in real time. So I want to ask the question about social media and the role that social media plays in shining a light on this, not just from the perspective of those of us in the United States who are trying to raise awareness, but also how it's now been employed by victims on the ground and how they use that to tether themselves to the outside world. And so there's been this assumption out there, at least in my field, in this sort of genocide prevention space, that if people knew more about what was going on, they would feel compelled to take action, just as you did, Becky. But the fall of Aleppo would suggest that even knowing and seeing isn't enough for people to take action. So I just want you all to sort of react to how you maybe start us off, Becky, how you're using it, how you see it as a tool for galvanizing awareness and attention, but then how it's also used on the other side, on the victim side.
Sure. I think one example, because when I started this, I got some criticism like, you're just tweeting, you're posting. I mean, you're not really doing anything. And I simply didn't agree with that, because I did feel that there were people all around the world who did feel frustrated like we did, that wanted to take action in some way. And one of the things that we did is we decided to target the second presidential debate. And we created a campaign called #AskAboutAleppo. And our goal was to get a question asked during the debate. And it wasn't so much to hear what Trump or Clinton had to say about it. It was just to elevate the issue. Because this was around a time when Aleppo was starting to get some momentum, but not quite the momentum that it received in the following couple of weeks. So we organized a very strategic campaign to engage folks, to tag folks from the hosts like Anderson Cooper and Martha Raddatz, both of whom we thought, of all the hosts of the moderators, we'd have the best chance with them because they've spent so much of their lives covering war, and it would be something very important and near to them. We also tagged Clinton, we targeted Trump, we targeted other world leaders, and just a steady drumbeat every single day. And when those of us in America were going to bed at night, there were people across, other countries across the world kind of taking on the lead to keep it going. So the day of the debate, we still had no knowledge or inkling that it was going to be asked, and it was. And I remember I was sitting up in bed watching it, and I really honestly started crying because I couldn't believe it. And I don't think we, again, take all the credit for that, but the fact that they did ask about it, Aleppo ended up being the #1 searched word on Google. It broke Twitter, it broke Facebook, and people were talking and asking about it. So I look at something like that and I say, it didn't stop the war, it didn't stop the bombing, but it helped wake up a lot of people who before that point in time had not maybe heard a little bit about it, but now they were researching it, they were looking it up, they were reading stories, and the engagement with our social media campaign, I think, grew exponentially after that. So it can create and lead to action. I'm not always sure that it can bring a resolution. I sure would like to see that. But I'd like to hope that at least this campaign played some role in helping to stem the tide that would have made it worse. I don't know, the history books will say that someday, but there's without a doubt that the new activism, grassroots in person, can never really be replaced. But if you want to be able to galvanize people from every corner of the world, every religion, every age, every background, you have an opportunity to do that on social media platforms.
How do you think they're using it? I mean, I've heard a lot of Syrians say, we feel like we've been forgotten, and maybe they feel like they've been forgotten at a policy level. Do they see this kind of action on social media, and do they?
Oh, definitely.
They do.
I mean, when I was in Turkey just last week, I met with Bana Al-Abid and her family. Bana Al-Abid is the 7-year-old girl who was tweeting from Aleppo, yeah. And her mother was tweeting also, Fatima. And I met with them, and I asked them how did they feel when they knew that there are people in Chicago who were retweeting their stories, and they felt that the world has not forgotten about us. And we felt very connected to Chicago and Norway and Japan and so forth. So even though in light of the bombing and the siege and the grim picture that they were having, but at the same time they felt that there is human beings who were caring about them because of the social media. And I think it's very important to recognize, of course, first of all, the power of social media, and I feel indebted to Wendy Woodham and Becky, who started Stand With Aleppo, and everyone who was part of Stand With Aleppo campaign, because we have millions of people right now who are connected to what's happening in Syria and Aleppo because of this campaign. But at the same time, you have to have a human face on the other side for you to connect. So I think you've mentioned numbers. Numbers do not move people to action. Even if you say 10 million or 20 million, do not move people to action. But one picture or one child or one doctor in Aleppo who you can connect with, that will move you to action. I think that's what we were lacking before this campaign, and now we have people who people can identify and connect with. But in spite of that, there is a limitation to social media. I think it gives us false belief that we have done something. I think it's not a replacement for the hard work of community organizing, of building coalition, of connecting with broader faith and civic community and pressuring your policymakers to do something. And maybe this is something that we have witnessed in Syria clearly, because there was a lot of social media activity, a lot of Twitter storm, a lot of Facebook storming, and so forth. I think this is the most documented genocide in the world in terms of pictures and stories and so forth. But in spite of that, our policymakers were not moved because we did not have the hard work in terms of pressuring President Obama, who is a community organizer, and he understands the power of community organizing, but he did not see or feel the pressure from faith groups and civic groups. And I think this is something that we have to question ourselves. How come that we did not do our homework, and how come that we did not connect with the victims in Syria? If these victims were not Syrians, would we have done something different? I think this is something that we have to reflect on as faith and civic people who believe in the power of citizenship. If this happened before 9/11, would the reaction be different? If this happened in a country that does not have large Muslim community, would our reaction would be different? I think this is something that we have to contemplate on.
So how can you maybe all speak to what you've done to try to connect some of your personal experiences to a political process? Because I know that you've been very active, doctors on Capitol Hill, and done briefings in Washington and in New York. How have you been received, and what has been the response? And to you, Becky, the same, bringing your sort of political advocacy into this. Where do you see this disconnect between the kind of indignation on the part of the population and the lack of action in policymaking bodies?
Well, personally for me, it was very frustrating. I was the national director of Women for Obama on his '08 campaign, and I was with him from day one. And I always like to say I agree with him like 90% of the time, but the 10% is on Syria and Aleppo. And I have to chalk that up to, he's a pacifist and has tried to really focus on keeping the United States out of conflict, which of course I appreciate, but I always feel that we're the standard bearers of democracy and standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. And it was incredibly frustrating to feel like, from time to time doors were closed or phone calls were not returned and, trying to seek some answers, or at least a why. I never felt like I got a why. I remember watching, the president address this, I think at his last official press conference, and I think his answer was something along the lines of, we made the best choice out of a series of bad choices that we made. And I understand that, but I do believe that, we had an opportunity early on to interject in this that I think could have prevented the loss of a lot of life and people having to flee their country. We can't go back and change it, but I think it needs to be a lesson learned that we can't take for granted that, if we support someone who we believe are very ideologically aligned with, that they're always going to be there when things get very, very difficult. And we have to be very loud. It's like social media is great, and we could have broke Twitter, pushing any leader on this, but unless you're in the room with them or you're able to get to people who are in the room with them, it's very difficult to really enact a change.
Dr. Jar, I want to bring you in because I know you've done these briefings yourself. And how has the response been when you've talked about it, in the moment? And why do you think there's been such reticence to take more kind of robust action?
The ones we've met have been very receptive. Dr. Zahir arranged for us to meet with representatives, senators, giving testimony at the United Nations Security Council. And we were very well received, and people actually cared and empathized with what was going on. It's just that they weren't really in any position to make policy. They could just make our voices louder, but they really weren't in that critical position to take further steps.
So I've talked to a lot of Syrian activists who have looked back a decade back to the Save Darfur movement, where there was marches on Washington, 500,000 people. There was in front of every church and synagogue a Save Darfur banner. We all had our bracelets. Why hasn't there been a Save Syria? Why has that not taken hold of our collective conscience, right?
This is a question I ask myself every day. And I happen to be Muslim, and I ask the Muslim community this question every time because I believe that the Muslim community have failed Syria in the United States. We did not see the outpouring of sympathy in the mosques or Islamic organizations, and I begged major Islamic organizations to react to what's happening in Syria from the beginning because I told them that what's happening in Syria and Aleppo is not limited to what's happening in Syria. It's affecting us. It's going to be affecting us here in the United States. And we know that the global refugee crisis that destabilized Europe started from Syria. We know that the rise of the extreme right parties happened as a reaction to that. We know that the terrorism that happened is a reaction to what's happening in Syria, Daesh and ISIS and all of these things, even maybe the rise of Trump. But people did not understand the gravity of the situation. We understood it, me and Sam, because we were going there, and we understand this huge changes that are happening in Syria, the displacement of population, the powerlessness that they are feeling, the chaos that is created, and we were conveying this picture to our policymakers. We met, tens of times with National Security Council. Up to President Obama. I remember in 2013, in month of August, 1 month before the Syrian gas massacre in Ghouta, I delivered a letter to President Obama in the White House at that time, and I told him, President Obama, I believe that your legacy will be determined by what you do in Syria. And he laughed. I mean, right now we're talking about his legacy. And he said, but my legacy will be determined by other things. I said, but Syria will be the main factor. I still believe in that. When I met with Ambassador Power multiple times, last time I met with her in New York right before the Aleppo briefing, she told me, I'm sorry that I'm wasting your time. And Ambassador Power was a reporter in Bosnia during the Bosnian genocide, and she understood the gravity of the situation of Syria, but I think she felt that she was a weak voice within the President Obama's administration. So people cried in the State Department when we were briefing them about Aleppo, national security. They were crying. When we had this briefing about the chemical weapon use in Syria in front of the Security Council, members of the Security Council, ambassador, they were crying. But we did not want them to cry. I mean, we did not expect them to cry. We want them to do something to end the genocide in Syria, and this did not happen. There was no leadership.
So let me kind of bring it back to the local and ask why Chicago has produced these leaders on this movement here. What's special about this place, and what, if anything, would you pass along to the unfortunate activists and doctors who are going to be responding to the next Syria, wherever that might be, because it seems to be replicating itself with some certainty across the globe. So when this happens again, what recommendations would you have, and what, if anything, would you tell other Chicagoans that they can be doing and should be doing?
I mean, I believe that everyone can do something to change the world. If they use their power, in the Muslim tradition, Prophet Muhammad says that if you saw an evil, you have to change it with your hand. And if you cannot change it with your hand, then you can change it with your tongue, with advocacy. And if you cannot change it with your tongue, then you need to change it with your heart at least. And that's the least of the minimum of faith. I think Edmund Burke says that all that is needed to the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And I believe that good men and women should do something when they see a genocide in Syria or any other country. I think Chicago is positioned to play a major role globally. We have a very vibrant civic society. Jews and Muslims and Christians are connected. We have a very rich interfaith dialogue. We have vibrant coalitions to address issues of violence in the inner city, immigration reforms. I used to be part of the Illinois Coalitions for Immigrants and Refugee Rights that has Jews and Christians and Muslims working together. So I think with this rich experience that we have in Chicago, we can translate that into addressing global issues.
And Chicago is one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the world and in this country, probably only second to New York. So I think we're exposed to so many different people and experiences that we can relate to them more personally. I always just think human beings are more moved to action if somehow they're personally connected to something, which is why in Stand with Aleppo, we tried to put, like you said, not the numbers out there, but faces and real stories of people so you could connect, which is why I think we had so many mothers who originally got engaged with this because they just felt like me, that real personal connection to the children who were literally slaughtered. And to see that, you couldn't help but be moved to action. I mean, throughout my life, I've been very engaged in lots of different human rights issues, and Chicago is just a home to that. We're a sanctuary city, proudly, and have been for a while. So I think Chicago, you can find folks who are willing to raise their hand and get up and take action. But I still think Americans, we're very caught up in our day-to-day. A lot of people are struggling. A lot of people are just not just struggling financially, but struggling to get home in time to make dinner and pick up their kids, and before you know it, it's 10 o'clock and they have to go to bed. It's hard to make time for things that are valuable to you. But I always say that, if that had been my child, if that Amran had been my child, if Alan had been my child, I would also want the rest of the world to speak up on behalf of me and my family. And I always say, if Americans think that we'll never be in that position someday, we're very wrong, because It's a matter of time to someday that we will, and maybe not in our lifetime, but we will. And I think Americans still, we are the standard bearer of democracy, and if we don't speak up, who is going to speak up? And I think when we do, others do. When we stay silent, others stay silent.
So I want to remind everybody that we're going to go to questions from the audience and I guess from online as well. So and then we have mic runners, so you can think about your questions and get your hands up. Sam, I want to just turn back to you and kind of bring you back into the last part of this conversation and just see if you had, from the times that you've been, I think one of our panelists said it best, that you have to kind of connect to the individual. You have to take these numbers that are so enormous and bring them down to one. And so if there's one experience or one interaction that you've had that you take away that kind of keeps coming back to you that you would want people to take away, what would that be?
Actually, it was my first experience in Syria 4 years ago when I was at M10. And back then it wasn't underground, it was overground, it was 3 stories. But it was August of 2013, and I remember a school being hit. And there were all these dead kids at school, and they brought in one child. All the operating rooms were full, and so the nurse was doing a minor procedure. He had wounds all up and down his body, and he had these bone fragments which were embedded in his skin. And the last thing he remembered when you talked to him was saying that, he said the last thing he remembered was seeing his best friend explode in front of him and other people. So we were actually removing the bone fragments of bystanders, which had projected into him. And his brother and his father were holding him down because we didn't have anesthesia. And I remember the father didn't speak any English. He looked like he was a villager, but he asked who I was. He asked why I was speaking funny and what I was doing in Aleppo. And when the nurse said that he said, "Oh, he's just an American. He's here helping out." He came up to me and said, "I've never met an American, and I never thought I'd meet an American." But he never thought it'd be the day when Syria was at war and its people were dying and doctors were being targeted and leaving, and an American came to help. And so that really resonated with me because that's part of the reason why I went and why I still go back. And you don't have to go to Syria to be helpful. It's not just about showing up and being in service to other people. It's also about standing in solidarity with the locals, like the doctors I met, the school teachers, the rescue workers, the white helmets. They were all over the place. And they were working in these underground hospitals and schools and orphanages. And they were doing it unarmed, unprotected, and they did it knowing full well that nobody was coming to save the day and that they were abandoned. But for me, they personify that, the essence of resilience and courage. And so that's what it's all about. It's not just about helping others. It's about standing in solidarity with them and being their voice, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or like what Becky is doing.
Great, thank you. So I want to open it up to Q&A from the audience, and I was told we would have a few questions on Twitter. Turns out we have a lot of questions from Twitter. So if I don't see, okay, I'm seeing some hands up here. How about we go up here in the front?
First of all, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm interested in any thoughts you have about what you think U.S. policy should be towards Syria at this point. Forget the political people in power. What in your hopeful moment would you hope it would be?
All right, so we're starting out with the easy one first.
I mean, this is not an easy question, and I think if you've read what the pundits and the think tanks have written about what should be our policy in Syria, I mean, you have volumes. But I think eventually we have to force a political transition in Syria. We have to work with our allies and enemies to force political transition in Syria. Political transitions means that an exit for Assad, because I believe after all of what he has done, no people in Syria, or the majority of people in Syria, will accept him to be a president. Now, how would that happen? It's a very difficult question. But I think we should be engaged with everyone. I don't think that we should say that we're not going to be intervene in Syria just because it's another country in the Middle East. Intervention does not mean military intervention. We should be a leader in the diplomatic effort to force a political transition. We should work with the Russians, with the Iranians, with the Turks, with the Saudis, with the Qataris, with the Lebanese, with the Jordanians to forge this political transition. If we want to prevent further chaos in the world, if we want to prevent terrorism in the world, if we want to stop the refugee crisis, I think it's good to welcome refugees in Chicago. And my wife Suzanne here is among the audience. She started her organization called Syrian Community Network to help Syrian refugees resettle in Chicago. But we cannot resettle 5 million people, right? So we need to make sure that the refugees go back to home. In order to do that, we have to have safe Syria with hope for the young people in Syria.
Thank you. There's a question in the back.
Hi, thank you all. Just Dr. Zahar, as a follow-up to that, earlier you seemed to cast some doubt on whether the next administration would help improve the situation in Syria. And I think one could assume that at least the effort against ISIS will perhaps increase. And I think you would agree that that's a significant part of the problem. So I'm wondering why your doubts.
I think emphasis on ISIS without looking at the bigger picture is not right. ISIS is part of the problem, but ISIS created because of the chaos and the extreme brutality of the Assad regime. Before 2013, there was no ISIS in Syria. So in order to address ISIS and prevent other ICCs from happening in the future, you have to win the hearts and the mind of the young people in the Middle East. You have 3 million children right now who do not have education in the refugee camps, in addition to the millions inside Syria. So how can you make sure that we have education and hope and jobs for the young people in Syria? How we can make sure that they have the same aspiration that our young children and young people in Chicago have, a better future, that they express themselves in the political system inside Syria. So in addition to fighting ISIS, we need to make sure that we also make sure that they have freedoms, they have liberties, they have education, they have jobs. And that's why only emphasizing on fighting ISIS will not lead us to the solution.
And I don't pretend to be an expert or a diplomat, but I don't believe that this incoming president, he's an isolationist. I don't think he's interested in engaging globally in issues that are humanitarian in nature. I think the vacuum created by the U.S. engaging in Syria early on opened up the door for Russia to play a pretty significant role in what's happening there. I think we all know he seems to be fairly aligned with Russian leadership. So unfortunately, I think I share Dr. Saul's pessimism that we are going to see a change in our policies in Syria anytime soon.
Right here in the middle.
Thank you. Our incoming president, in his infinite wisdom, has chided, indeed, he has accused Mrs. Merkel of opening her doors to the Syrian refugees. I don't think that this was a very intelligent move, to say the least. Mm-hmm. What do you think about this situation? I find it very disturbing.
You're asking about the situation of Syrian refugees in Germany?
Indeed, of which there are some 750 to 800,000.
Yeah, so I think one of the, if I read between the lines, I think one of the questions or one of the arguments that's emerged is that Chancellor Merkel has created a kind of pull factor, right? By being hospitable, and you essentially invite invite greater numbers than you should be, or that you can reasonably take in. Is that maybe? Why don't we try to respond to that? Do you see, and certainly the doctors from having been on the ground, Is it your sense that people want to come to Chicago, as great a city as it is, or would they rather be going home or going to Berlin?
I think, I mean, the refugees are just like us. They're just like you and me, but they do want to go home, and but they're not going to go back if their children are going to be bombed or gassed to death. That's the way I see it. I think it speaks more to the fact that the answer isn't finding homes for refugees, it's solving the problem. It's addressing the crisis head on, as opposed to just addressing the symptoms, like humanitarian aid for refugees or just fighting ISIS. The bigger picture is solving the crisis, and I think that's what that question speaks to.
I feel indebted forever to Chancellor Merkel. If someone who's German here, we really feel indebted to the German people. I think among the world leader, she was the best in terms of addressing the refugee crisis. She did what is right to open the door for people who are desperate, who are fleeing, extreme atrocities. And I think this is something that every world leader should appreciate. And I feel really mad that President-elect Trump has said what he said. I feel also embarrassed that United States of America, that is built on the refugees and immigrants right now, only had 14,000 Syrian refugees, while our neighbor in the north had 40,000 until now. They have much less population than we have and much less resources. And I think we should really pressure the administration to believe in the American values of opening the door for refugees, Syrian refugees. Syrians in general are educated, they are entrepreneurial. Every Syrian person I know here is either a physician or an engineer or has a small business. And Steve Jobs is the son of a Syrian immigrant. We have many successful Syrian physicians who are healing millions of Americans. So I think we have to emphasize on the fact that we should open the door for Syrian refugees, and we should appreciate what has been done by Turkey, by Jordan, by Lebanon, by Germany, and encourage them to keep their doors open. This is the right thing to do.
So I want to ask a question from Twitter that's trending on our platform here, which is, what can we do after we leave this discussion to help the humanitarian crisis in Syria? Do you have any thoughts on?
Well, I'd say a few things. Something that's very tangible is that you can contribute to organizations who are on the ground in Jordan, Turkey, elsewhere, who are serving refugees. It's like one thing, I'm putting my money towards something, I'm doing something to help a child or a family improve to some extent their quality of life. I also do believe, of course, you have to be loud and noisy, and if you have a congressman or a senator, they're going to be in your neighborhood, go to the meeting and make sure you ask a question about Syria. I mean, they have to hear it. They have to feel that there are people who they represent actually care about this. Otherwise, they'll just keep the status quo. I think if everyone, in this country one day was to raise their voice about it, you'd see some change. But you have to be vocal. You have to engage and not think that you're just one person and it can't make a difference. Because when Wendy and I founded Stand With Aleppo, we were just two people. We were just like, we got to do something. And it's helped engage millions of people across the world. So you have to know that your voice really does matter, and you have to speak up and make sure that your elected leaders know where you stand.
I'd also add that there are a lot of organizations like the Syrian American Medical Society, Doctors Without Borders. They have various missions to places like Greece, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan. And all you got to do is show up. Even if it's for just 3 or 4 days, you don't have to be a doctor or someone with medical training. You can just show up and learn more about the people you meet, refugees, and then that just empowers you so that when you come back, you'll actually have more strength to advocate on their behalf when you do write letters to your political leaders or when you write articles for your local newspapers.
I mean, I ask myself this question, that if I lived in the middle of the Holocaust, what would I have done? We always say never again, but do we really mean it? And never again means that every person should do something when we have a genocide like this. And this is the worst humanitarian crisis in our lifetime. Collectively, we're talking about 12 million people who are displaced, 5 million refugees, 500,000 who were killed at least, and in addition to the people who died of torture, chemical weapon used multiple times. So I think every physician and nurse can volunteer in medical missions. If you're someone who has a leadership role in your community, inform them about what's happening in Syria. You can inform your synagogue or your church about what's going on in Syria, organize something to help Syrian refugees in Chicago, talk to your congressman, to your senator. I think everyone has a role to play, and I think eventually, I always tell my friends that, maybe 50 years from now, my grandchildren will ask me, what have you done to address the crisis in Syria, the worst humanitarian crisis in your lifetime? And I would like to tell them that I went into some medical missions and I treated some children, and they were smiling after this. So people in Syria want to live, children want to have education, patients want to be healed. I think each one of us can plant a smile in the face of a Syrian child.
Thank you. Did you have a question up front? Yeah. Up here front.
Thank you for being here today. I'm a psychologist, and I recently returned from a fact-finding mission in Germany where I interviewed a lot of Syrian refugees who had made perilous journeys to arrive into Germany. When I spoke with the Minister of Integration, she told me that the top priorities for receiving nations for Syrian refugees arriving are housing, employment, language. As physicians who have intimate access to the context that these Syrian refugees have undergone in a particularly war-torn area, would you agree with that perspective, or do you think that Syrian refugees arriving in receiving nations have different needs?
Great question. Mm-hmm. So doctors, you've been in neighboring countries and treated. What are you hearing from them?
I wouldn't disagree. I mean, that is what we're hearing.
I think, we go to Jordan and Lebanon where Syrian refugees are treated as refugees. They are in camps, and they are not equal under the law, and anytime they can be kicked back to Syria. And this is something that I feel very sorry that in the 21st century that we have people that are treated like that. Some of them are in open-door prisons in some of these camps. But here in the United States, of course, they need housing, they need jobs, they need education to their children, and they are getting that. My wife will explain to you the process. Some of them are traumatized because of what they have witnessed in Syria, and they need mental health and counseling. Language is very important. Many of the people who came from Syria to Europe are educated, and I think with some tweaking and adjustment, they can participate in their society, and they can be active, and they will not be dependent on the system. The same thing here in the United States. But treating them as equal, caring about them, embracing them, I think that would be very helpful.
Can I ask a follow-up on the sort of the psychosocial treatment and its availability inside the camps? How much of a priority is it to treat the person and what they've seen and experienced, as it is to give them, sort of basic care of other kinds?
It is a priority. I can only speak for Doctors Without Borders. When I worked in their Ramtha project, which is a surgical project, so they would receive, like a lot of the kids that I would see, for example, in Syria that were missing limbs, they'd get shipped off. I'm not really sure what happened to them, but in northern Jordan, Doctors Without Borders has a hospital where they receive incoming wounded who require multiple operations. For example, a teenager who loses his leg will require maybe 5 or 6 more operations to get the wound to heal. But they actually had a full-time psychologist and psychotherapist on hand to help families, to help patients with that, with losing their home, losing a loved one, losing a limb, and learning how to accept that and move forward. So it actually is a big priority, and it is accessible for those who seek it.
I was just going to say to that I met several Syrian refugees here and made friends with one of them. She's a woman, and I think what was challenging for her is she was the only one from her family to come here. She didn't know anyone. She felt very isolated. And I think if you have an opportunity to befriend one, it's very important to them, because She got taken advantage of early on because she didn't know any better, wasn't familiar with our country, our culture, and our customs. And being able to be there to listen to them, go out to dinner with them once in a while, outside of, course, the basics that you need to survive, I think that they need friendship.
Second row back, and then we'll come over.
Yes, I'm thinking about the 6 years of tragedy there, the many Muslim countries throughout the world, not just the Middle East, and the enormous populations throughout the world. And why has there been no organization really, within the UN, for example, really pushing hard to try to get an answer here from the very beginning? And why hasn't there been more organizing, such as the social media we've just heard about that Becky spoke? Be right away from all those countries that you would think, Muslim countries, that you would think really would be deeply concerned.
I mean, I'm asked this question multiple times when I do presentations, and I live in the United States, so I care about my country here, and I think we should be the leader in the world in terms of addressing the genocides like this and embracing the refugees. But countries that have Muslim majorities have done what they have to do. Turkey is a Muslim country. They have 100 million people. They receive 3 million Syrian refugees. Jordan is a Muslim country. 1 out of 10 people in Jordan are Syrian refugees. Lebanon is mostly Muslim country, and 1 out of 4 people who live in Lebanon is Syrian refugees. So Muslim countries have done what they are supposed to do. But I think the question is, what should we have done here in this country? This is my country. I cannot affect what policies in other countries, but I can, tell my congressman here and my senator, how come that you have not done what we're supposed to do? I think this is the question that we should ask.
You had a question up front.
One, thank you again for being here. Truly heroes, for many of us who haven't had the chance. And so thank you again for your leadership on this. One quick question to maybe move to the hopeful side is there's been some interesting entrepreneurial projects and other humanitarians that have also been noticed by society. The White Helmets might be one. Another entrepreneurial project is Netakalam, which is folks here in the US or elsewhere in Europe employing a Syrian tutor, usually a refugee tutor, to teach them Arabic. Are there any other of these hopeful stories that you've seen either in Syria or amongst the refugee populations outside that you haven't had a chance to share that you'd love to share?
I mean, there's tons of positive stories. I can tell you, what my organization is doing, Syrian American Medical Society. Besides sending medical missions, we started this telemedicine program to connect hospitals in areas under siege to doctors in the United States. So through your computer or your iPhone, you can look at a hospital or a patient in Aleppo or Idlib or Daraa, and you can talk with the physicians over there. They can ask your advice, and they can show you pictures and x-rays and labs and so forth. So we are using technology to connect hospitals in areas that are difficult to reach or under siege to doctors in the United States. And I don't think that this was done in any other conflict. And we are partnering with the United Nations to expand this pilot program. I mean, there's a lot of things that are happening, but this is what comes to mind. People in Syria are very resilient and they want to live. And I think there's a lot of good programs that are happening in Syria. And we need to be aware of that and build on that.
I feel like this side of the room is really dragging. Okay, we've got one over here, but I'm gonna come back over here. So get a question ready.
Yeah, I have a good question, and thank you for all the helps that you guys done. But I think for a non-Middle Eastern person, it's very easy to understand. It's actually very difficult to understand the things that are happening in Syria right. And now, I think that conflict outgrew just a fight for democracy. It's a proxy wars. It's sectarians. It's a Sunnis versus Shia. It's Kurds versus Turks. There has been opinion in the public that maybe Syrian people have to accept that Assad will stay in power. It will appease Iran and Russia, and maybe U.S. will help with Saudis and Turkey, and then together they will drive out what's left out of Daesh and maybe al-Nusra, and start rebuilding Syria with money from European governments and the U.S. And you mentioned something about resilience of Syrian people, and me being Middle Eastern, I know what it is. How much resiliency do people have, and would they ever accept that Assad might stay in power?
I mean, that's an excellent question. And of course, you have always in conflicts like this, you have the short version, which is, people went to demonstrate as part of the Arab Spring. The regime responded with brutality, and then people carried arms. And then you have the more, complicated issues. And definitely there are multiple parties that are right now intervening in Syria. There's at least 13 countries that are intervening in Syria. That will make things even worse. But the bottom line is still that, what started the Syrian crisis is still there, that you have a regime that is oppressive. I lived in my adult life under the rule of Hafez al-Assad, the father of this president, for 30 years, and he was extremely brutal. And then his son, it looks like, inherited the same brutality. And I think this has to change in order for people to start, living the future and feeling the future. And the Syrian diaspora is very resourceful, it's very educated, and it will help rebuilding their homeland with the help of other international communities. But they need to have a hope that, that this regime will not be there on the long term. On the short term, I think people will accept compromises. They will accept Assad, for example, to stay in power for a few years until you have, maybe parties, multi-party system and election and so forth. But I don't think that people will accept a war criminal to stay in power for the long term.
All right, I'm going to go to Twitter. And maybe this is a question that we should aim to end on. And so I'll ask for all of your thoughts on this one. And that's simply, what should we be hopeful about as we leave this discussion? So what you all who work in this every single day and can be mired, presumably, in pessimism and the reality of the situation on the ground, what is the thing that gives you hope about this and about the future? Why don't we start with Dr. Attar?
Well, for me, there's always hope, but I emailed one of my friends, for example, who's an orthopedic surgeon in northern Syria. I said, Happy New Year. And he emailed me back, thank you very much. And he said, I'm not really sure what happiness is anymore. Because when I go for maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks, but these guys have been living it for years, living under siege, under fire, witnessing horrific atrocities occurring daily, witnessing these war crimes, taking care of innocent civilians being massacred and slaughtered, and yet they're still there. They brave these conditions, and that's been the best part for me going on these missions is actually meeting them, these doctors, these nurses, paramedics, the white helmets, the rescue workers. On our last mission, we went to, Dr. Zahir and I visited an orphanage, which was underground, and it was run by a guy that just, he took care of kids who had lost both parents in the war. And those are the people you don't really hear about, but those are the ones that give me hope that if and when this war does end, these are the ones that will pick up the pieces. There are good people on the ground that are making these little differences that do and will add up over time.
Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've not had the experience of being on the ground, and there was a time when I was planning to try to go to work in a camp in Jordan, and there was also an orphanage in Turkey, and then Americans are being told not to go to Turkey, and someday I hope to get there, but the relationships that I've been able to build through some of the folks who are there, especially Dr. Omar, who I learned was your roommate when you were there last time. I mean, despite the fact, this is a guy who would go through like 4 or 5 brain surgeries in a day when a regular neurosurgeon would do like maybe 5 a week. And he still maintained a sense of humor. And on some days when I'd get very emotional about what I'd read in the paper and what I'd see and what he'd convey to me, like, here he was trying to perk me up. And I just think it gets to your point. The resilience of the people there is so amazing. I think like when you find yourself under that kind of duress, it really tests you. And I think it just inspires me to keep fighting and keep our voice going, and just until we demand that there is finally peace brought to this country. And I hope that that energy just keeps flowing and going. So, this effort and this work that everyone has done can actually lead to the result that we ultimately want.
Last word, Doctor.
I think that the fact that we have 300 people attending this session after 6 years of war in Syria is hope, bring hope. That means people are interested and people want to have solutions and people want to be engaged and do something. This last medical mission that we went to Jordan, the majority of doctors and nurses were not of Syrian origin. When we have Becky and Wendy and Dr. Blessman tweeting about Aleppo, who have no connection at all to the children of Syria, and they're doing that out of their free time in spite of their busy schedule, I think that's very hopeful. When we have a cardiologist from my hospital who is an Indian American who went there and started doing cardiac cath for patients in Syria, in Jordan. She's doing that in Jordan for the first time. That's should bring hope to everyone. I think there's a lot of things that can bring hope, and we need maybe to highlight these issues so for people feel that they can do something to end the conflict in Syria. Sometimes we stress, especially in the social media and also on TV, about the atrocities, about the destruction and so forth, and we don't highlight the positive things. I just want to end with one story. In my second mission to Aleppo, I wanted to go to one of the hospital called Al-Zarzur Hospital. And the head of the hospital called me and he said, "Don't come, there is a barrel bomb," and they destroyed the upper part of the floor. So I waited for a few hours and I went there, and I thought that he's gonna be outside of the hospital. He was a surgeon and he was actually inside the hospital, and he was inspecting to salvage some of the medical supplies so he can use it in other hospitals, so after he evacuated the patient. So this person, who is a physician, was not afraid on his life. But all what he wanted is to save other patients' lives and salvaging some of the medical supplies in the destroyed hospital. I think if each one of us thought that you have people in Syria who want to live and who want to help people to live, that will bring a lot of hope to us that maybe we can do something to help them living.
Thank you. I want to put in a very small plug for my institution, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, because we produced this video that you saw at the beginning because we were so moved by their story. It's on display inside our museum, along with another video about the white helmets, to tell the more than 2 million people that visit our museum every year how this is connected to the history of the Holocaust and the idea of never again. So I want to thank our panelists for all that they're doing to bring about a positive change in their communities and in their nation. And thank you all for joining us tonight, and our host, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you all very much.